Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. We know these are challenging times, and we really appreciate you making the time to be here. So in terms of today's goals, we heard from communities that folks wanted to stay connected, even as folks are working remotely during this unprecedented time. And so we thought we'd pull together this meeting to give folks an opportunity to do that. And we also want to share updates on the current state of affairs at the policy and legislative level, and really create an opportunity for communities to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on their students and their work, and then engage communities on the implications of the stay-at-home orders and how the impact that that's having on student services and supports in your community, and provide an opportunity for communities to share and learn best practices from one another. So in terms of our meeting agenda, we've started with the welcome and goals, and then we'll have some policy and legislative updates, and then we'll have some breakout sessions, and we'll give more instructions on how those will be done, where folks will have a chance to talk about what's happening in their communities, and then we'll share out what we hear from folks, and then we'll talk about network supports and advocacy, and talk about resources and next steps. And now I will turn it over to Emily Raska from Ed Systems and Ann Whelan from Advance Illinois to talk with us about some state and federal updates.
Thank you, Edith. On behalf of the network organizers, we're really excited to be able to talk with all of you today. And I'm pleased to be here with our colleague Ann Whelan at Advance Illinois to just talk through some of the policy implications for COVID-19 and how we're staying plugged in as a network and as network organizers. So generally, we just kind of wanted to name the ways in which this is playing out, right? And the ways we're thinking about this as network organizers as we do this work. And so, obviously a lot of the work that's happening currently is federal. That's gonna be a lot of different funding streams that are gonna come down. We'll talk a little bit about those, or Ann will talk specifically about those in just a moment here. But thinking about what that means on the ground for those of us here in Illinois and how we're equitably implementing those funding streams, and thinking about how our state legislation can be thought about in an equitable manner as well to really address our community's needs across the state. At a state level, just continuing to keep an eye on the actions that our governor and our legislature are taking to make sure that it's mindful of the different needs across the state, as well as thinking about what's going to be needed legislatively to support students in an ongoing way as they are transitioning through this disruption in their learning and what that means in the fall, and how we think about how we position our institutions to really recover from this, both across the P20 spectrum as well as into workforce, and then thinking about how we can support continued investment into evidence-based funding as a way of ensuring that we are not causing greater inequities in our state as a result of this crisis. And then finally, at a local or institutional level, thinking about what student and CBOs might need across our communities as you're trying to serve individuals on the ground, young people and adults alike, thinking about what you guys need in your communities across the state. And so how we can as network organizers amplify that and get that to policymakers to make sure that your needs are being met. And of course, ongoing sharing of resources amongst our network. And that's both resources that we're curating as well as resources that you all are going to be able to share, whether it's resources you're developing yourselves or resources that you're finding elsewhere. And we'll speak a little bit more about resources a little bit later. We'll start with the federal policy response. We'll have our colleague Ann from Advance Illinois share a little bit about that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in Illinois specifically.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for letting us join you and provide this forum for today. I'm going to be providing a very high-level overview of some of the federal actions that have been happening over the past few weeks, and I'm happy to answer any questions via chat, or if you want to reach out, I'm happy to do that or help you find the answers. So first, wanted to just remind us that we've actually had 3 stimulus packages that have passed through Congress and been signed into law by the president. The first one happened in early March, which provided additional resources for testing. The second one, which is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is on the slide in front of you, happened 2 weeks ago now, I believe, although time is very mixy right now. And this one was really targeted towards ensuring that there was 10 days of paid sick leave, as well as some additional resources for unemployment, some additional supports around testing, as well as resources targeted towards food assistance programs like WIC and SNAP benefits. Wanted to be able to spend the bulk of the time on the federal updates on the CARES Act, which passed into law last week, which was the $2.2 trillion stimulus package. Within that law, there was $31 billion for education. A little over $13 billion is going towards K-12 schools. That's going to go out to states via the Title I formula, and 90% of those funds are distributed directly to districts via the Title I formula, although there is significant flexibility in how districts can use those funds. So they can use them for any use of funds that's allowable under ESSA, Perkins, WIOA, and IDEA. Additionally, there is $14.25 billion for higher education. 90% of that is going to go to institutions, which is distributed via 75% will go to schools based on Pell eligible students, and then the other 25% would go based on non-Pell eligibility. And then the remaining higher ed resources are going to historically Black colleges and universities and institutions that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And then $3 billion of that $31 billion is set aside for governor's use at your discretion to use early childhood through higher education. And that is maximum flexibility around those uses of funds as long as it's targeted towards anything in with education continuum. Additionally, in the bill, we saw some resources specifically targeted towards early child care, so about $3.5 billion for the Child Care and Development Block Grant and $750 million for Head Start, and then over $20 billion set aside to help with feeding our students and families during this time. So ensuring that particularly those families that rely upon schools for breakfast and lunch and sometimes even summer nutrition, that they have access to these meals and this resource during this time. Stimulus law also provided some additional waivers to the Secretary of Education to help ensure that there's needed flexibility during this time. So as you guys may have seen, the federal government has waived the need to test the summative test this spring and has frozen accountability determinations for next year under ESSA. They are also offering and entertaining waivers associated with some of the fiscal allocation requirements under the law, including the maintenance of effort expectation, how much money a district can carry over from this year to next year in order to provide some maximum flexibility in terms of ensuring that these funds are going to the schools and students who need them the most. But again, happy to answer any additional questions that people may have specifically on any of these things. And let me turn it back to Emily to talk a little bit about some of the workforce provisions.
You know, while we focused a lot on the education provisions in the CARES Act, this was the first bill that really provided a significant amount of funding that allocated a lot more funding for workforce provisions. And so in addition to the SNAP supports that Anne was just describing, really the bulk of the workforce provisions are centered on expansion of dislocated worker national reserves, so mitigating that immediate crisis of dislocated workers from the workforce. But there is also a provision of funding in order to support paid family leave provisions and unemployment insurance provisions from the Family First Response Act as well. And then there's expansion of unemployment insurance benefits. And so that's both the duration, so the length of time that an individual can qualify for unemployment insurance, as well as the amount, which is increased by $600 each week, which is a not insignificant pot of money and will hopefully help stabilize a lot of incomes. So we can go ahead and advance the next slide just to talk briefly about the Illinois response.
Can I just add just one quick thing, Emily?
Yeah.
I do want to say that although this did provide $31 billion to education, in 2009, during the Great Recession, we did get over $100 billion for education, largely because we saw such a significant impact on state revenue and the ability of states to sustain their educational investment. We do anticipate that there will be implications to the state budget this year and state revenue. So there is continued conversation about a fourth stimulus package in order to provide additional resources we know will be needed to stabilize the economy and our school environment going into potentially the next fiscal year, which is a wonderful transition to the Illinois policy context.
So just a brief summary of the latest actions from an Illinois standpoint. Obviously, Governor Pritzker is offering daily updates at 2:30 p.m. every day. That's why we rescheduled this meeting. The legislative session is canceled for the time being, but we've been told that it could reconvene at any moment and likely will be reconvened mid to late April for a short session that probably would be focused primarily on state budget or other critical measures, including health system assessments and things of that nature. So keep an ear out for that. We will continue to monitor that situation. On Friday, the governor released Executive Order 15, which essentially puts into place the actions implicated in the waivers that Illinois has already applied for with the U.S. Department of Education, including suspension of state assessments, flexibility on school terms, the definitions around school terms in terms of length of time and days required, as well as, or what those days need to look like, and then as well as the district calculation of daily pupil attendance. Early childhood block grant funding can actually now be used in this, as of this executive order, to help provide childcare for employees who have to perform essential work. So that's a bit of flexibility that has been needed. And then, of course, Governor Pritzker has also announced the COVID-19 response fund, which is largely being supported by philanthropy and private individuals. And that's going to be geared towards rapid response funds, essentially. And in the last few days, we've actually gotten a set of recent agency guidance around remote learning recommendations, which essentially is kind of focused on how can districts and communities be focused on what students and staff need, documenting the best efforts, particularly when it comes to how work is being managed for students with IEPs or 504 plans, ensuring how to manage that the remote learning is being done in aligned and relevant fashion to standards, and really just providing a continuity of education and connection and learning so that folks can be having as smooth of a transition as possible given the disruption that's happening. In terms of dual credit guidance, again, this is very new guidance that has come down from ISB and ICCB. The core of it is that the secondary and post-secondary institutions need to be collaborating closely about what makes the most sense in their context to transition the learning virtually, offering incompletes as opposed to pass-fail so that students can not be penalized for this disruption in their learning and based on what's available to them, encouraging post-secondary partners to offer virtual platforms or virtual resources that might be helpful. So if the college can provide a Blackboard site for courses that are currently being taught at a high school, how can those platforms be shared in a way that's supportive of student learning? There's some language in there around career and technical education and how if and when in-person instruction can resume, that it happens in a socially distanced manner. But really the core of it is trying not to penalize students and encouraging the direct collaboration of the secondary and post-secondary institutions to minimize disruption of learning and ensure alignment. And then there's been a joint statement that's, again, linked here around pay and work in the education context. So essentially trying to minimize disruption of pay and continuity of pay and work for staff and teachers across our education institutions in the state. So those are all linked here. Again, we'll share all of this out down the line. I know we've got a question in the chat box from Emily Goldman of PCC about whether or not COVID-19 funds will be allocated to institutions or students directly. Anne, I would defer to you. As far as I'm aware, it'll probably come through institutions as opposed to students directly, but I don't know, Anne, if you've heard anything different.
Actually saw Robin was on the call, so my guess is she's actually the best person to answer this one. Robin, if you're still on.
I am still on. I don't know that there is complete clarity. My guess is with Emily that that's still unfolding, but that this will be through institutions just for management purposes. Also
Sure.
For the pay issues, I think folks know that there is a significant pot of dollars that are being made available to nonprofits to access, some of which may be forgivable loans. Those will be awarded on a first come, first served basis, which I don't know has been fully aired. So for any nonprofits in your orbits, I strongly encourage you to get them in. Those applications will go via their bank partners, whoever they're banking with. So to put them in touch with their banks as quickly as possible so that they get their application in the queue at the earliest possible opportunity, which I believe will be this Friday. So more to unfold on all of this. And I think our effort should be to try to keep you posted and to share information as everybody gets it.
Thank you, Robin, for that. And we can go ahead and move forward. But we wanted to just provide space to check in. I know that there's, obviously that question that we just handled from the chat box, and we'll continue to monitor the situation, of course, and share out whatever we hear. And we'll explore whether or not, future webinars like this will be helpful for folks. But if there's anything else that folks have been hearing about, feel free to put it in the chat box. We will get more specific information on the nonprofit implications of what money might be available to nonprofits, whether that is through the CARES Act or through the Families First Act. My understanding is that it's CARES Act and some state dollars that might be under exploration with the COVID-19 response fund. But are there other questions or other policy implications or policy efforts that are happening that you guys have been hearing about, and anything that you've heard about other groups that might be taking under efforts to address this from kind of a policy standpoint and a systematic standpoint? And we'll have breakout sessions to talk specifically about what you as communities are doing, but generally sort of from a systematic standpoint, what are some of the things that you guys have been hearing that have been happening?
And please feel free to let us know in the chat or just jump in.
So I'm with the Sauk Valley Chamber, and with COVID-19, we've been working closely with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The two loan programs, one is the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. If you are a 501c3 and you have fewer than 500 employees, you are eligible for that, and that's the loan forgiveness program. And then the second one is the EIDL program, which is the economic disaster loan assistance. And so they're both through the SBA. One, the PPP is modeled after the 7A, and the EIDL program, which was the disaster relief assistance, that is also available 501c3s. So the U.S. Chamber has a great briefing on that. It's a 4-page briefing.
That's great, Chris. And if you want to share a link to that in the chat box, we will definitely include that in the resources that we share out after the call. Thank you very much. And Antoinette, you were jumping in.
Hi, and I don't know if this is the right place for this, but I saw questions, so I'm just going to put it out there. I am the chairperson of the Illinois Attendance Commission, and so you can imagine that quite a bit of inquiries really early in March about attendance and chronic absenteeism and indicators, and a lot of places within our state's ESSA plan that talk about attendance. Senator Collins is the chief sponsor of the Attendance Commission, and she and I have been talking regularly about two focal points, really the post-crisis response that the Attendance Commission will be putting together to address this and work very, very closely with our stakeholders around the state, and then building that community of practice resources that we want to share. And 60 by 25 has been a big part of our work. What does chronic absenteeism and attendance, the impact that it has on our state's 60 by 25 initiative? So I really hope to work closely with this group to gather your resources so that we can include them in our community of practices that we're going to be building out on our website, and then just to help craft our post-crisis response, because this is going to be very, very important that we do make sure that the voice of the 60 by 25 community, what you're doing, what you're seeing that the commission might need to address is going to be very, very important. And then we have included, we've worked with the state leadership. We have a COVID-19 resources special link that's on the Attendance Commission page, so that right now, the only thing the Attendance Commission is saying publicly about this is exactly what State Superintendent Ayala or Governor Pritzker is saying. But moving forward, we will be creating some things and working closely with all our stakeholders to make sure we address this, as well as maintain momentum that the state was gaining around chronic absenteeism and attendance. Anything I can do in the future to work with you guys with 60 by 25 is going to be deeply appreciated.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Antoinette. And we'll definitely, like I said, we'll share via our listserv, which I'm assuming is how folks got this Zoom link today. We'll share all the resources that we have and continue to collect via the chat box and discussions here. We're making notes of all of these different component parts. So appreciate the partnership and looking forward to being able to continue to support the work of the Assistance Commission and figure out how we can learn from the Assistance Commission's, your community of practice as well, because that's what we're hoping to do and accomplish as a network here. So thank you to those of you who have been sharing resources in the chat box. If you think of other things as we're going along, feel free to add them into the chat box as we're continuing to discuss, but we'll go ahead and transition ahead because I know we've got a lot of folks on the line and we're hoping to do some really robust breakout session discussions with all of you here.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Very grateful for the opportunity to be in community with you all, especially as we're all kind of isolated in our homes. So thank you again for coming. We really want to engage in conversation with some smaller groups to really just learn about how your community is responding to COVID-19 and how the network might be helpful during this time. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes in breakouts. And the questions, I'll read them out loud for you all, are how is COVID-19 impacting your work and students in your community? How are your communities responding to our current reality and what is going well? What are your fears and concerns as it relates to students and families we're serving, both in the now and as students prepare to return when schools reopen, like in K-12, or when schools overall, like when we being able to be out and about? And how can we be helpful to each other during this time? So as I mentioned, we're going to break out into about 5 breakout groups. So while I do that, you can start thinking about the questions that you are going to discuss with the group.
Okay, great. Yeah, I will just hit real highlights and we can always follow up more in chat or follow up. But, you know, again, what many of you are probably experiencing, some support organizations that normally provide workshops in person with students, especially, you know, things about soft skills, executive skills, you know, how to do an interview, making eye contact, shaking hands is kind of hard to do in a virtual, but they are doing that. Also, that there's concern for many of the students who maybe were going to be graduating from high school without a really solid plan for life after high school. Maybe they weren't going on to some type of post-secondary education. And we know that the workforce out there is going to be a different landscape. While we do have some employers like some grocery stores hiring, but some other businesses that maybe were going to be opportunities aren't going to be there necessarily right away. Also, a request for any good online resources or virtual resources for work-based learning would be of interest. Our friend Betty at IMSA, the Illinois Math and Science Academy, she'll be sharing out through the chat or otherwise with the network about some different resources for innovating students. So that's kind of an expertise that they have in helping provide different resources that happen when there's disruptive. And then Robin from Advanced Illinois talked about maybe something a little more in the future, but we need to be thinking about is what's going to be the need to address learning recovery. So whether it's a K through 12 student or a post-secondary student, there's going to be disruption in their learning, and what's that going to look like and how that could potentially look differently, and the equity based on students, not only geographically, but just socioeconomically too. So learning recovery is something we'll probably be hearing more about as we get through this. And again, we had some folks from the nonprofit sector, community foundations that were really wanting to listen in to this webinar today to see how they can be of most use. Because again, they serve the entire community. So again, it's great to see their involvement. And I'd say that those are our main highlights.
Thank you guys again for the great discussion in our small group. I'll just, echo a lot of Sam's comments, and then just say one of the big things that kind of came up in our group that I think will probably resonate with a lot of folks in the line is that the sort of myriad and domino effect of every single decision that's being made at this time, right? And the ways in which these impacts are being felt in families and in community units, et cetera. So thinking about the implications for individuals who are essential workers who live at home with folks who are more vulnerable to this disease, what it means for them to have to go to work and be required to go to work, but also be living with folks who may be more vulnerable and not wanting to put them at risk. And also just the fact that this is impacting different populations differently. Who's eligible for these supportive funds that are coming down both from the federal government as well as the state government, thinking about undocumented populations and where there may be concentrations of that and the impacts of that economically for those families, as well as in decision making for students, for example. So a student who comes from a mixed status family, maybe was planning on going to college after high school and graduating this year, and may have to make a different decision because they have to go out and get a job in order to support their family economically, given the eligibility or lack of eligibility for some of these financial supports that are going to be coming down the pipeline. So thinking about that, and just thinking about just recognizing that there's a lot of hurry up and wait, and waiting to find out what resources are going to be available truly on the ground, how it's going to filter down is a stressor, and folks are really doing their best. There was some good examples of how people are doing their best to try and prepare as best as possible and plan as best as possible, but just acknowledging that until certain decisions are made, sometimes folks, they're hurrying up and waiting. And so recognizing that tension. And so just wanted to name those things. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap with other communities or groups as well.
I think for my group, it was very similar, some of those concerns just with learning recovery and all of that. But I think one of the big things that were shared out was the resources that students actually had available. How to prioritize their needs, whether that be the needs of actually having like learning, but also having basic survival needs if you're thinking about food or any things of that sort. One of the nice things when we shared out what are some things that are going well, one of the key things that I think found was also communication, that they're keeping constant communication with the students and the family, not only about like what's going on, but giving them reliable resources. So I think that one thing to keep in mind as we move forward is things that we are doing well so that we can share those out and it could be replicated as well.
This is Edith. In our group, we talked about resources that are currently being developed to support students during this time. And I asked the folks who brought that up if they could share those resources with us so we can share them more broadly. In the southwest suburbs, they're doing a survey of clients to see what's needed. They're getting a lot of requests for rental assistance because they work with both high school students and adults. We also heard that ISB has put out a resolution for school boards to adopt if they need to relax some policies so they can serve students more quickly. And some boards have created opportunities for students to get lunch. There's also school districts that are being encouraged to check out their science labs to see if they have personal preventive equipment that they can donate to health institutions. We heard from someone who hosts students for internships that she's getting lots of emails asking her to expedite evaluation so that students can get credit for the work that's been done. And they're also developing resources to help students support that. In Vermilion County, we heard that they are working with employers who are laying people off and putting that information out to the local Illinois workforce system and Illinois hiring boards to share where the needs are. They're also looking at transferable skills. What skills are transferable without people having to go through a long onboarding process? We heard about District 186 put out a request for technology needs, and they're doing a lending program for devices. There are obviously concerns around online curriculum because parents who are working from home have to oversee this. There are also concerns about access for students who might not have either internet access or just access to those resources. And like everybody else has said, what folks think will be super helpful is for the network to share resources with everybody. There are some simple resources that we can put out that others can use. So we had a pretty robust discussion. Thanks.
I'm happy to go next. We had a great group that in our conversation echoed a lot of the things already shared, but access to technology and internet is obviously a huge concern. Learning loss and this quick transition from in-person to remote learning and the steep learning curve and the resources needed to do that have been very challenging. Antoinette reminded us of an e-learning pilot, and we are kind of scheduled to know more about that in 2021, but we're having to kind of build the plane as we fly it. Concerns about thinking about supporting work-based learning and student working opportunities. This also may be a moment where competency-based education models is something that we think more about. Things that are going well, Rockford Public Schools, Bridget shared this really great learning instructional site for their teachers, and over 1,500 Rockford Public School teachers are taking advantage of that to share lesson plans, and so that is a bright spot. Mark also shared about just the importance of listening in this moment and listening to educators and making sure that we're lifting up stories from the field and that we continue to have more platforms like this where we're continuing to connect in a moment where people may feel very isolated and alone in this. So continuing to create these spaces. Questions around how high school students are going to be earning credits. There's thought that the first semester would be what they earned and the second semester pass-fail, but wanting some more guidance on how to move forward students. And then appreciated Susan Stanton on our line, who works with out-of-school time professionals, and the idea, we talked a little bit about learning loss and the potential for taking the summer to do more schooling, and encourage us to think about partnering with community-based organizations who typically work in the summer to support student learning at that point. So really thinking about after-school time providers and how they're working with the school district to support students. I'm sure I missed a lot of things, so people in my group, feel free to add anything in the chat I missed or share now. Thank you.
So I think that for me, a lot of takeaways are around truly it takes a village to support our communities, our students and families during this time. And I can tell that all of you are stepping up and doing whatever you can in order to be as helpful as possible right now. I heard a lot about resources that were shared during the conversation. So if you have any resources that you mentioned, please include them in the chat so that we can send them in the follow-up as well. Because truly, it seems like there's a lot of really great things happening in the communities, and it's always great to also share, best practices. So I will kick it to my colleagues for discussion on network supports and advocacy. Sam and Jill, take it away.
So again, appreciate everyone joining this call. I mean, there's 60 folks on this call, and there really is just power in connecting and identifying what are the common issues and ways that we can work together to ensure our students have what they need during this really critical time. So wanted just to pose some discussion questions. And again, we have 60 people on the line, so please don't be shy, either in the chat or speaking out loud. What are the resources that we can share with each other? What are ways in which this network can be helpful to each other at this time? And are there ways in which we can advocate together? Coming from Advance Illinois, we're a policy and advocacy organization, and there are opportunities to potentially let our elected officials know what is needed in the communities right now. And so want to make sure that we are listening to you all and to your constituencies to make sure that we are asking for the right things that we need in this moment. So I'll give folks just like a couple seconds to think about these questions, and please share in the chat or out loud if you have reflections. And Sam, please feel free to add anything I missed.
Right. Or if there was something you wanted to share within your own small breakout group that you didn't have the opportunity and you'd like to speak it versus put it in the chat, now would be a time to unmute yourself so you could share it with the entire group if you wanted to.
I did want to just add, I know we're hearing a lot about, especially with the changes now focusing on remote learning, not hearing a lot about how can we help parents deal with this. Parents are now finding themselves being the main instructor, the teacher, and we did hear from a person in our breakout group, the challenges of now, making sure that your child is engaged, but what if you are staying at home, but you still have to work via Zoom or whatever, or what about those parents who are essential workers? So I haven't really heard about how we are supporting parents as they take on this new role. I've heard people kind of joke around and, well, now they get to spend time with their kids, but they're not the ones that went to school and are the experts and all of that. So I don't know if there's any resources already out there, or if that's something that, we can look at in regards to just assisting our parents with this new normal. There's some challenges, they're trying to keep the kids busy. I've talked to some parents who, they're doing Zoom play date because their kids are, there's a whole social aspect to this that our kids are missing out on as well. So like I said, if there's any, resources that can be shared on that, or if it can be created, something that we can share with parents as they face this new normal.
The P20 Family Community Engagement Committee has been feverishly working on pulling some resources together. I don't know if it's out of draft form yet, so I would not share it here, but what I can do is connect.
It's finished, Antoinette.
Emily, or is it? So
yeah,
is that something
Susan.
that we could share out?
Yeah, let me look for
Susan?
Yeah, let me look for the link and I will put it in the chat box.
Thank you, Antoinette and Susan. Other topics or questions that people would still like to learn more about or have questions about, or maybe it's something we haven't thought about yet because we've been dealing with the immediate needs, but something else that might be in the near future for us to think about.
Not to take over, but I do have a question again. I think it kind of came up. Does anybody know for certain in regards to what ISB has put out? Are they counting attendance with students and grading? That's probably two of the biggest questions I've heard. Is it, should districts be counting attendance in some kind of way? And also, what is the grading gonna look like? I heard, pass, fail, does anybody know for certain what that is?
I know we have some ISB folks on the line. We will be sharing out that guidance document, and I don't want to misspeak in terms of interpreting that guidance document that outlines implications for attendance and grading. I know we had at least earlier some ISB colleagues on the line, but if any of you are still on the line, would welcome your input here specifically.
Emily, this is Marcy Johnson. I
Awesome.
would
Thanks,
say the
Marcy.
same thing. Go to the guidance document and read what's there. I know that attendance and grading has been addressed in that document.
I second that for sure. The attendance commission, as I said earlier, we are only saying what Superintendent Ayala is saying and Governor Pritzker is saying. We just want to make sure we don't do anything to frustrate the process for anyone at all. And it's just updated regularly. So we have it posted on the attendance commission website. I'm sure most of you, if you're not already, you can jump on ISB's website, but they update it regularly. And that's just the best way right now to make sure that we address it and we have continuity of messaging across the state.
Can I ask a question about that? So I'm a community partner. We're not in the education field. There seems to be some confusion for those of us that are kind of on the outside of this. Are districts to be doing engaged e-learning with educators and students? Is it a quote recommendation? We have so many districts and they all seem to be on different pages. Is there a standard of what is to be happening? Is it mandatory they do remote learning right now? There's confusion by
So again, this is Marcy. There was a document that was just posted on Friday. If you haven't seen it, it's guided for documents for remote learning days. And we're working on emergency rules for remote learning, and districts can do e-learning or remote learning. So just look at that guidance. I would rather you read that than me quote something wrong.
And again, we'll share all these resources in the body of an email, including the slides and the recording from today. I just pasted the links for the remote learning recommendations, the guidance on dual credit, and the joint statement around pay and work, that into the chat box. So that's accessible there as well.
Other comments or other topics that people are still wanting to learn more about or would want to share?
I'm going to jump in and share out some of the stuff that we're seeing on the chat.
Okay.
So Brent said, as we start to better understand learning expectations and graduation considerations, being able to pull together working sessions or sharing sessions about best practices among schools, having a standardized approach outside of state mandates would help us prepare for this in the future and address challenges together while centering equity between districts. And then Lynn mentioned maybe occasional 45-minute 60x25 Zoom mini meetings on different issues. For example, technology issues for our students who now need to be on Zoom. What if a Chromebook breaks? Helping our parents, building engagement online, thinking about loss of learning, attendance, and grading issues, and students graduating and looking for work, etc.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm thinking about, and this is sort of, I know a lot of different groups are thinking about this, is sort of where's the value add of us as a network, and where can we refer you to things that are happening that we hear about, and how can we amplify those resources that are being created, just so we're not reinventing the wheel, but that we are being additive in all ways. So I think this is probably something we're going to be taking back as network organizers, to think about what's our lane and where can we be the biggest value add, and then where can we be referring out to the people who are on the ground doing this work, right? Who know the most about some of these issues in particular. We have certain expertise, but there's obviously a wealth of knowledge across our network and across the state and all of the communities in it. So as evidenced by this chat box with so many different resources. So we'll be definitely thinking about that.
Emily, can I ask a quick question?
Go for it, Daryl.
The grant work that we've been doing for the teaching, well, really any of the high school endorsement grant work, have you guys put anything out about, continuing that, extending that? Are we, obviously it's on hold slightly. Is there any sort of, and maybe you guys mentioned this earlier, is there any information that needs to go out to those people working on that? And I don't know the dates, it might end this year. I don't even know what they are. I just sort of thinking about that.
Yeah. This is Edith. I'll jump in, and we are working on that, and we'll get information out to communities in the near future. But that's something that we're definitely thinking about.
Other comments or questions, topics that popping in your mind? And I think just to borrow what Jill said before about we're all kind of building the plane as we're flying it here. And I think to Emily's point too, we want to be respectful of people's time. We don't want to be duplicative, but we also want to make sure that people are getting information. Sometimes I'm the type of person, I'd rather have it more than one time than not at all. So because our network is so broad and wide, that might be something that, you may be hearing about things from multiple channels, but at this point in time, I think people are grateful to have the information, and then they can decide if it's applicable to them or if they've already received it, then not at all. Well, maybe now it might be a good time to switch over, kind of starting to wrap up with sharing resources. And I think my good friend Anna was going to kind of talk about this.
Thank you, Sam. Like Sam mentioned, we're getting a lot of resources. So The resources that we came up with are from the state. The first link to it is going to be the coronavirus one. That one is just giving you the latest update on how many cases we have, deaths, and so on. Then we also have ISB. With ISB is going to be some of the most helpful information as educators. They're doing any information, any newsletter, any guidance for educators on how to move forward, especially with e-learning. Then we also have guidance from ICCB. With ICCB, is going to have guidance for faculty and staff, and then also some student resources as well. And again, all of the educational agencies, they're also giving updates pertaining to education that the governor is also giving out. So these would all be reliable resources as well. With IBHE, they have information and guidance for colleges for how to move forward with e-learning and what the process is with that. With ISAC, we have guidance on the link that we provided, guidance as to what we're doing in order to still reach out to the public and still provide some of our services to the public. And then lastly, with the Department of Commerce, that's just guidance in general for the state of Illinois, whether that be employees or employers, on guidance on grants, the loan programs for businesses. So I definitely recommend that you check out all of these. They're all reliable resources, and they also, in addition to giving their own guidance, they also provide updates with anything that's going on related to COVID-19.
I'm going to add really quickly. I know that most of you folks heard from us through our network newsletter list. So I know that you get that email from Edith, one of our colleagues. So you can feel free to email her, or you can email any of the network organizers with any resources that you want to share, any questions, or there are folks in your community that you're working with that would benefit from a conversation around this. Please let us know, and we can forward the invitation to them as well. Thank you all for joining us. We diligently took notes during this conversation. And so after the call, we're going to bring our notes together and share the recording with the full network. We'll share any materials as well. We'll share the resources that were listed on the previous slide, as well as anything that was shared. And then we'll continue to provide avenues for collaboration and conversation. It seems like you all also have an appetite for that. And we'll continue to provide direct supports as needed to all of you. And I'm going to kick it to Edith to do the full close-up.
So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And we hope that you and your families continue to stay safe and healthy. And we also would request that you begin to consider how stimulus funding reaching your communities might impact your work and what support you might need to consider to those implications. And that's one of the conversations that we'll continue to have with you in the future. And please continue to share with us any resources you think will be helpful. And as my colleagues have already said, feel free to reach out to any of us or to me directly with any questions or additional resources that you have for us to share. So thanks again, and you'll be hearing again from us about the next webinar.
Thank you so much,
Take care,
everyone. Have a blessed day.